Hello, hello. Welcome to Weekends with Kasparian and Nando Vila. It's good to be back, Nando.
Great to be back. I'm feeling good. I'm feeling fresh. I'm feeling renewed.
Feeling excited
for today. Feeling fresh,
like
very
that.
fresh. Feeling renewed. Feeling excited for today's show. We got brother Dr. Cornel West.
Yep. I'm so excited. I mean, so it's a pre-taped interview. We're going to toss to it after we do our decode segment. So if you see us looking different, dressed differently, it's a pre-taped interview, but I promise you're going to love it. I think we asked some pretty good questions in regard to, the left-wing strategy, how to keep fighting, even though we're experiencing some pretty dire times. Things look bleak, but he always has this ability to kind of pump energy into you, and get you to just see the bigger picture and think strategically about how to move forward, which is difficult to do, really, but he's great.
Yeah. He's amazing. He's out there stumping for Nina Turner today. I saw some videos that came out of that. Nina Turner's election's on Tuesday. We wish her luck. Hopefully she can beat back the Democratic Party's establishment candidate who's just well-funded, by all the most awful people in the world, endorsed by Hillary Clinton, all that stuff. So, at least she's got Cornel West in her corner.
Yeah, Cornel West, Bernie Sanders, AOC, there are some pretty big name progressives out there campaigning on her behalf. So fingers crossed, corporate Democrats have poured a lot of money into the corporate Democrat candidate's race. So that's Shontel Brown. And she's awful. She's so awful that, during a recent rally speech, she needed a clap track to make it appear as though, there was a big audience that was supportive of her message. And by the way, her message was mostly, I'm able to reach across the aisle, as if Democratic voters are interested in playing patty cakes with corporate Republicans. It's just, anyway, so we'll see how that all plays out. But for the purposes of our show, Nando, why don't we start off by discussing two topics. The topic that I wanted to talk about this morning is, or afternoon, depending on where you are in the country or the planet, is a laboratory, a pharmaceutical laboratory that makes generic drugs. It's actually shipping its jobs over to a different country. And this is relevant because it shows you just how the financial interests of our politicians play a huge role in the decisions they make or whether or not they intervene on certain issues, right? So let's give you the details on that. So there's a critical plant that manufactures critical generic drugs in the state of West Virginia. Of course, that's the state where Joe Manchin happens to be a senator. And they are deciding to move their operations abroad, threatening America's generic drug supply, which is something we should be very thoughtful about considering the fragility of our supply chains, what we experienced during coronavirus, but it's also outsourcing thousands of unionized jobs. So Vanity Fair did an excellent job with this piece. I highly recommend you guys check it out and read the entirety of it. It has all these details and tidbits that we can't get into for the purposes of this show right now. But they write that Mylan Laboratories has made 61 drug products, including a substantial portion of the world's supply of a critical thyroid medicine. It's 1,431 highly trained workers. That includes analytical chemists, industrial engineers, and senior janitors among them are represented by the Steelworkers Union. All are slated to be laid off by the month's end, meaning literally today. It's the last day of July. And just to give you a sense of how much downsizing had already happened with this laboratory, at its height back in 2016, the Morgantown manufacturing site employed more than 3,700 full-time employees and made more than 1,400 drug products, a scale that dwarfs most American drug manufacturing sites, according to FDA records. And so when the Steelworkers Union approached Joe Manchin, they're trying to get in touch with him. They're like, look, Joe Manchin says he cares about unionized jobs. He says he cares about jobs in the state of West Virginia most of all. So we just need to get a meeting with him. We need to talk with him, and I'm sure he'll intervene. Except the opposite happened. They get in touch with him. He's on the Senate floor. He gives them a brief 10-minute conversation over the phone. And here's what he says to them. Sorry about your luck. It sounds like they've reached a corporate decision. There's very little I can do. There's
nothing to be done. Nothing to be done.
No. I mean, right now he's like, puffing up his chest and walking around the Senate floor like he's the actual president of the United States. He understands the kind of power he has. But when it comes to this laboratory, when it comes to these jobs in West Virginia, he's not doing anything. Why? Well, this laboratory recently did a merger. And in the process of that merger, his daughter, who was an executive at Mylan, receives a $30.8 million golden parachute. And her buddies are still working at Mylan as executives. So let's not stir the pot. My daughter's making a buck off this, and we don't want to upset anyone.
Yeah, I mean, it's just one of those things in America. The political system is not geared toward protecting jobs or anything like that. I mean, it's just fully dedicated to protecting corporate profits, even if that means decimating local jobs. I mean, politicians often, are stressed a lot about like jobs in their state and things like that. And like there was the whole story of Chuck Schumer, trying to, give massive subsidies to, like microchip manufacturers to bring jobs to his state or whatever. But like when push comes to shove, they will never do it in a way that threatens corporate profits. They'll do it by, offering these like insane tax breaks and things like that, like just giving them more money to like beg them to stay in the state. And then often they don't anyway. I mean, but there are, it's the government. They can do things like there are things to be done. There is industrial policy to be done. They can start their own, they can take over factories. They can force companies to stay here. There's a million things that they can do, but there's this kind of learned helplessness from our political class that is just like, what are we supposed to do? We're just the government. We can't intervene in the economy. Like that'd be crazy. We would never intervene in the economy. And then in the case of Manchin, obviously there's this comical conflict of interest with his daughter making tens of millions of dollars. I mean, it's a perfect microcosm of what our government is vis-a-vis its role in the economy. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Joe Manchin is like a walking sign for everything that's wrong in our federal government, right? Because he's a walking conflict of interest, because this is just one of those conflicts of interest. Another conflict of interest is his personal investment in a hotel chain in his own state, which is why he didn't want to increase the federal minimum wage. That would actually hurt his bottom line. Then we found out recently that he's receiving nearly $500,000 a year off of his investments in dirty coal in the state of West Virginia. Like, he is literally financially incentivized to work against us. Doesn't matter if he's a Democrat, doesn't matter if he's a Republican. And so, like, when I take a step back and I think about what are the solutions, right? Because, we're about to talk about the eviction moratorium ending, and you look at the federal government and it's just dog crap. It's absolute garbage. I mean, what we're seeing in the way that they're handling the infrastructure bill, in the way that they've responded to the economic concerns of people who are still laid off, still don't have their jobs, and are about to get evicted. I mean, it shows you how broken that system is. And Democrats are unwilling to use the tools in their toolbox that, honestly, as much as I can't stand the guy, Donald Trump had no problem using obscure rules and provisions to get what he wants. Democrats aren't willing to do it.
Of course not. And you bring up the eviction moratorium, which just expired. And, aside from the human catastrophe that is, right? Millions of people potentially evicted in the coming months. All these people are behind on their rent. There's been no rental assistance. There's just been this eviction moratorium, which is the absolute bare minimum thing with to be done in a case like the coronavirus pandemic. But if you zoom out from a political level, from a political standpoint, a Republican that runs in the 2022 election can easily say, when we were in power, we protected you from getting evicted, and then the Democrats got in power and they let you get evicted. And they would be correct about that. Like, they would be 100% correct about that. When we control the government with Trump and we control the Senate and the House, we passed an eviction moratorium. When the Democrats got in there, they took it away. Yeah. And what's the argument against?
Absolutely right. I mean, like, the accurate argument would be, but I mean, it's a weak argument, but the accurate argument would be, yeah, you guys had that moratorium, but you let BlackRock evict hundreds of people anyway. You didn't actually enforce the moratorium. And by the way, those evictions continued during Biden's administration as well. That's why it's an incredibly weak argument. But in terms of messaging, we already know what the story is. We know that the Democratic Party really fails in aggressive messaging, especially when Republicans tend to have a point. And in this case, they absolutely do have a point. What is amazing to me is that everything in the federal government is so overpowered by corporate donors that Democrats can't even see straight. They can't even see the damage they're doing to their own political careers because they're following along with what the corporate donors want. I mean, these landlords, corporate landlords, they don't want the moratorium to continue. I mean, BlackRock just snatched up a bunch of single family homes. They want a return on that investment. They want to be able to evict the people who are unable to pay their rent. And so I have no doubt that these are the kinds of conversations that are taking place behind closed doors. I mean, this is not the United States of America. This is the Chamber of Commerce, the United States of Chamber of Commerce. Like, that's what this is at this point. And that's the problem. And it doesn't matter if Democrats are, kicking their own asses and hurting their own political futures. They're just going to keep doing this. And it's pathetic.
Yeah, I mean, and it just goes to show. I mean, Nancy Pelosi, the speaker of the House, the leader of the Democrats in Congress, the nominal kind of left of center party in the United States, faced with this kind of absolute human catastrophe that's oncoming, that's coming. I think there's as many as 6 million people that are behind on their rent. There's no rental assistance coming. With landlords able to evict these people, there's nothing stopping them from doing it. And she didn't even know about it. I mean, Kale, can you pull up the tweet? She goes, Pelosi says part of the problem was last minute notice from White House about the need to handle legislatively. Really, we only learned about this yesterday. Not really enough time to socialize it within our caucus to build the consensus necessary. Okay. She just had no idea that this was coming. Nothing to be, she needs to be told.
Why?
It's not like there was media coverage of this. Of course there was. There's been reports. There's been we knew the deadline. The deadline was put into the legislation in the first place. But they forgot about it, or they didn't know about it, or they didn't care about it, or they just don't know anyone who's at risk, in their own social lives, because all these people are rich. Right. And it's just, to them, it's an abstraction, not a reality.
Exactly. I mean, there's the disconnect in terms of the insane wealth that members of Congress are experiencing right now, while the majority of Americans are struggling economically. But also, I mean, the system is set up in a way to ensure that they're able to keep doing what they're doing, right? I'm going to keep repeating this. The fact that they're able to be invested in individual stocks. I want to know how many members of Congress, both Democrats and Republicans, are personally, financially invested in corporate landlords, right? These are publicly traded corporations. Are they invested in them? And I would be shocked if they weren't. So that's what I'm talking about when I say conflict of interest. They're looking out for their financial interests. And actually legislating on our behalf, representing the best interests of the American people, goes against their own profit motive. That's the problem. The system is set up this way.
It's very bleak. It's very bleak.
I know.
But
I know.
Should we read some books
Let's read some
help
books.
Ease the pain? To help ease the pain. Well, if you want to ease the pain, you can join the Verso Book Club and get every new ebook that Verso publishes each month, as well as one or more books in the mail. All Verso Book Club members will also get 50% off everything on the website, including the Verso Comrade tote bag, for as long as you are a subscriber. All memberships are 50% off for your first 3 months. The Comrade tier is only $20 a month, and if you join in August, you get these 4 books: A World Without Police: How Strong Communities Make Cops Obsolete by Geo Mar; Investigative Aesthetics: Conflicts and Commons in the Politics of Truth by Matthew Fuller and Ayal Wiseman; The Age of Precarity: Endless Crisis as an Art of Government by Dario Gentili; and a new edition of The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State by friend of the show, Frederick Engels, with a new introduction by Jennifer Doyle. So yeah.
You know what? I mean, reading The Age of Precarity, will definitely ease the pain. Like, definitely check that out.
That'll make you feel better.
No, I mean, but understanding, like, the thing that I like is reading about movements that have worked, right? And it gives you at least a bit of a playbook to understand how to proceed forward. I mean, I try to think of it that way, but it's still, things are tough. Things are definitely tough. All right, I'm looking for my decode segment, and for some reason, I'm not seeing it. Give me 1 second.
Yeah.
Not good.
Send it
not
to you?
good.
No, very not good.
No. I have, like, I didn't print out, like, the first page, which is a bit of a disaster. Oh no, I got it. Okay, I'm ready.
Got it.
I'm ready.
Alrighty.
Let's do it. All right. So let's have some fun. Let's go to a music festival. So as we speak, Chicago is hosting Lollapalooza, a massive music festival, despite the fact that, unfortunately, new cases of coronavirus are in fact spreading and spiking. The city's largest music festival is being held at full capacity from July 29th to August 1st. It comes at a time when the city is seeing its average daily number of new coronavirus cases more than double in a matter of weeks. Now, for the purposes of this decode segment, I'm not going to get into how frustrating the spread of the Delta variant is, but it is important to at least consider why a massive music festival will be held or is being held as the numbers of new cases is spiking. And it's because of course, the profit motive behind these music festivals. And so that got me thinking about the profit motive, but more importantly, something that's kind of been whitewashed in the media, the notion of millennials wanting to avoid spending money on things in order to spend their limited resources on experiences. And the fact of the matter is, it's part of this economy that economists, capitalists have been talking about for decades now. It's known as the experience economy. And when you really hone in on what makes the experience economy succeed and how it allows for capitalists to control our amusement, our entertainment, the more pleasurable parts in our lives, it can get incredibly infuriating because we should be able to control what we do or how we enjoy our free time. But when it comes to music festivals, as fun as they might seem, there have been some pretty massive hiccups. So in fact, that human desire for something that's been exploited and commodified by capitalists for profit is what's referred to as the experience economy. Here's a little more about it.
In the past 20 years, the Western world has shifted from buying things to buying these kinds of things. In other words, experiences.
My name is Joe Pine, and I'm going to tell you all about the experience economy.
Joe has written a book called, The Experience Economy.
Well, what's happened is we've gone from an agrarian economy based off commodities, through an industrial economy based off goods, to a service economy, and today we're in an experience economy. What experiences really do is that they engage everyone inside of them.
And it's all designed to create this unique communal experience.
Living in the digital age that we are now, there's more need than ever for people to connect. That's what festivals do the best.
I mean, it's ironic, isn't it? Because when you really take a step back and you look at what capitalism supports or endorses, which is individualism, while shunning collectivism, then they try to find ways to exploit the isolation or the alienation that we might feel as a result of the capitalist system, right? And to be sure, we were already feeling that alienation, that isolation, that atomized way of living prior to the pandemic, but the pandemic has only exacerbated that. So it's completely understandable that humans have this need, this desire for community. Those are the experiences that they crave. And it's only gotten worse, or at least that urge has only become more pronounced in people's lives during coronavirus-related shutdowns and social distancing. Now, again, capitalism celebrates individualism while shunning collectivism. Workers feel alienation from other people because they're either seen as their competitors for scarce resources and wages, and it's also very easy for people to be alienated from others when they're constantly working and have very little time for rest or for pleasure or for communicating or connecting with others. In other words, capitalism leads to the alienation of workers, and then it finds ways to benefit from it and profit from it by offering so-called experiences. Now, the Harvard Business Review was already advising businesses on how to exploit alienated people looking for more meaning in their lives, looking for more community in their lives. In fact, they wrote, quote, "An experience occurs when a company intentionally uses services as the stage and goods as props to engage individual customers in a way that creates a memorable event. Commodities are fungible, goods tangible, services intangible, and experiences memorable." But do we really want the capitalist class to decide which experiences in our lives are memorable? Do we want them to tailor certain experiences for us to experience a sense of community? Now, music festivals are actually a great example of what the Harvard Business Review had written about, because the music is merely a prop. The experience, large masses of people letting loose together, is the experience.
A 10-year British audience survey revealed that headline acts are a deciding factor for only 8% of festival goers, but 53% said the overall experience is the reason they bought their ticket. We asked these festival goers why they're here.
A lineup will drag me in, but when I'm here, sometimes I don't even see any music.
I'll be honest, I don't know any of the friggin' music.
It's nothing to do with the music, it's all atmosphere.
Nothing to do with the music. It's all atmosphere. And listen, that's fine. But let's understand what that atmosphere is about. It's about a sense of togetherness, about celebrating something together with your fellow humans, something that we're not able to do on a day-to-day basis. Now, look, a good case study is actually Woodstock. The story of Woodstock in the summer of 1969, of course, has been rewritten and romanticized, which I didn't really know about until fairly recently. That myth was then capitalized in the 1990s when the same men behind the original Woodstock decided to create subsequent Woodstocks in 1999 and, by the way, 1994, which for the most part went off without a hitch. But we should focus a little bit on the 1999 Woodstock because it was a disaster. Now, Woodstock 99 ended in riots as attendees whipped up by 3 days of anarchy-fueled music burned the fairgrounds. 44 were arrested. There were 10 reported sexual assaults, but a cursory glance at the footage, male attendees groping topless women with glee, assures there were many more. In fact, there's a fantastic documentary about this called Woodstock 99 on HBO. It's relatively new, and I highly recommend it. The facilities collapsed under the weight of 200,000 visitors. Over 1,200 were treated for medical conditions. 3 people actually died. Now, Woodstock 99 was riddled with the failures of capitalism, from its deceptive marketing to its price gouging. The marketing for Woodstock 99, again, relied on the romanticism and revised history of the original Woodstock in 1969. Although the concert became free when an expected crowd of 200,000 grew 500,000 strong, it was actually conceived as a business proposition. The 1969 Woodstock Music Festival was the brainchild of 4 men, all aged 27 or younger, looking for an investment opportunity: John Roberts, Joel Rosenman, Artie Cornfield, and Michael Lang. Lang had organized the successful Miami Music Festival in 1968, and Cornfield was the youngest vice president at Capitol Records. Roberts and Rosenman were New York entrepreneurs involved in building a Manhattan recording studio. So we're talking about businessmen looking to put together a music festival for profit. But things didn't really work out the way that they intended. And as a result, there were literally hundreds of thousands of people who were able, and I think this is a good thing, to enjoy the music festival for free. But here's the problem. It wasn't really a feel-good time in a lot of cases. And this next video will explain why.
As one official pointed out, with 300,000 people, you are not dealing with just a crowd, but virtually a city. And as a city, it had city problems. One youngster died of a suspected overdose of heroin. 80 others were arrested on drug charges. Another boy killed when the driver of a tractor failed to see him inside a sleeping bag.
What happened at White Lake this weekend may have been more than an uncontrolled outpouring of hip young people, struggling as they did to survive. First, the 20-mile traffic jams, 5-mile hikes. Then the intense heat and sudden rain, the thirst and hunger from the shortage of water and food, just for the opportunity to spend a few days in the country getting stoned on their drugs and grooving on the music.
And grooving on the music. I love that news report. It was actually a pretty fair news report by CBS back in 1969, which you can check out on YouTube, and I highly recommend it. Now, the entrepreneurs behind the original Woodstock happen to be the exact same guys looking to make a buck off music festivals and merchandising today. Woodstock Ventures, the firm that oversees the licensing and intellectual property related to the Woodstock Festival, is still run by the original producers of the event. And for several decades now, that once ragtag group of hippies has evolved into, if they weren't already, good businessmen with savvy instincts. Now, that's an older Reuters piece, and to be clear, their instincts ain't so savvy, especially when you're putting festivals together with the very clear financial interest. They want to make a profit off of these events. And as we know, the best way to make a profit is to minimize costs and maximize the profits. So one can understand why they would want to rewrite history or the history of Woodstock, because Woodstock Ventures also happens to be the same group of guys behind Woodstock 94 and 99. So they made a bunch of dumb decisions with Woodstock 99 by choosing a military base in the middle of the summer as the venue for the event. Take a look.
Woodstock 99 was held on Griffiths Air Force Base. Constructed in the 1940s, the base was used for military aircraft maintenance. There were some areas of turf, but for the most part, Woodstock 99 happened on 1,100 acres of airplane runways. The grounds were so expansive, visitors had to travel 1.5 miles between two main stages. This is how Rolling Stone journalist Rob Sheffield described the scene. It was a few miles of asphalt surrounded by barbed wire. There were a few patches of grass. But for instance, if you were looking for some grass to lie down on, you're not going to lie under a tree or on a hillside. You're not going to see any flowers. It was a place that was designed to house jet fighters. Kevin Wasserman, the Offspring's lead guitarist, you know him as Noodles, was even more critical of the locale. We played this festival in Nuremberg at an old Third Reich park. So I've played a venue that was literally built by Hitler, that was more hospitable than that Air Force base was.
But the event's organizers were giddy once they secured that military base as the venue for, ironically, Woodstock 99, right? Like let that irony sink in for a second. Why were they so giddy about it? Well, if you're doing this music festival on a military base, then you have this infrastructure at your disposal that can prevent people from sneaking into the concert for free. They weren't going to let that original mistake of Woodstock, at 69 happen again. They wanted to ensure that everyone who was there paid the ticket to be there. And so, of course, you're dealing with asphalt in the middle of summer in Rome, New York. Temperatures are extremely high at 100 degrees, and asphalt increases the ground temperature. People were incredibly hot and grumpy as a result. And by the way, speaking of tickets for Woodstock 99, remember, this is 1999, sold for $150 and ballooned to $180 on the weekend. A single serving of pizza, meaning a slice of pizza, was $12. And guess what? The situation wasn't any better when it came to bottled water. Water sold for $4 a bottle. Unfortunately, free tap water was incredibly hard to come by as well.
Imagine around 250,000 people trapped in a concrete pen surrounded by barbed wire. Now imagine shutting off that population's water supply. Unless you were working the festival, that was your life for 4 straight days. Of course, festival attendees had 2 choices. They could either buy a 12-ounce bottle of water for $4, $6.20 if you adjust for inflation, or stand in line for free faucet water from spigots that were sparsely located up to a half mile away from the main stages. The wait in these lines took hours. Eventually, people got frustrated by their shabby water conditions and started destroying the water spigots, their only free source of water.
So imagine being in that environment, right? The conditions on the ground, you're hot, you're dehydrated, you're being price gouged left and right when it comes to sustenance and hydration. And when violence finally did break out, at this concert or this music festival, some concert goers said the violence was directed at the high prices promoters charge for food, water, and merchandise, which is completely understandable. I mean, I'm not recommending violence, but when violence breaks out in response to that price gouging, in response to the horrible conditions on the ground, organizers should probably take a little responsibility for it. Now, believe it or not, it actually gets worse. The organizers of the festival skimped on security and also hired inexperienced randos who walked off on the job when things started to get a little sketchy. So even though the crowd wildly outnumbered the law enforcement presence, roughly 500 New York State troopers plus local PD, the authorities were supposed to have a little more support courtesy of volunteer security recruited from New York City. Volunteer meaning unpaid. However, many of those volunteers unceremoniously walked off the job by wandering off into the audience, leaving the police severely shorthanded when things got out of hand. So these event organizers who are putting this whole thing together for profit wanted to cut costs by refusing to hire professional security or refusing to pay actual state troopers or enough of those state troopers to do the job appropriately. They wanted to rely on free labor, and they paid the price for that. The organizers also didn't invest enough on pumping out porta potties, which is an incredibly uncomfortable thing to talk about, but it's relevant. So there were at least 2,500 portable toilets acquired for Woodstock 99, but they began to overflow by the second day. The excess waste combined with dirt and spigot water to create a bacteria-infested cesspool that stretched the length of the grounds. But you know what? You think that's bad? It gets worse. It gets worse. So kids were complaining that sewage from overflowing toilets was going into their tents. They were sleeping in it. They couldn't believe that was what they were expected to live with. By the end of the festival, at least 1,200 tons of solid waste and 500,000 gallons of liquid waste were produced by concert goers. In fact, if you look at photos of the event, you'll see people who didn't realize that the mud wasn't really mud, it was raw sewage, just completely covered in that mud, covered in that raw sewage. I can't even imagine what that smelled like. Now, the conditions on the ground were miserable. People were hot, they were dehydrated, they were covered in literal shit. And the lineup of mostly new metal music also didn't help to calm the furious festival goers. The reboot of Woodstock for an audience mostly born after the original festival in 1969 was a proto-fire meltdown of grotesque American excess, a panoply of late 90s nonsense, Kid Rock strolling on stage in a white fur coat, Limp Bizkit as a main draw, mostly young white male Gen Xers paying to see new metal acts in a poorly managed swamp of filth. So they rioted.
The crowds are blowing up CO2 tanks from the tractor trailers. They got troops in there with riot gear. They're forcing everybody out. Mass chaos.
I mean, a lot of people, I think, are frustrated at the whole profit thing of this, but there's a different way to show it.
So one of the things that happened in the aftermath of this disastrous music festival was the organizers, the investors, the very people who put this literal shit show together, tried to blame the performers for the riot. I mean, the music, to be sure, it's new metal music. I mean, it is what it is. But they hired people like Limp Bizkit to do what Limp Bizkit does, right? They knew what his music was about. They knew what his performances looked like. And they tried to pass the blame on Limp Bizkit and his performance for what started the rioting. No. And this is true of other instances where something goes wrong in a company, where something goes wrong in a bank, like Wells Fargo, for instance. The workers are the scapegoats, not the investors, not the executives, it's the workers. And in this case, regardless of how you feel about the performers, regardless of how you feel about Limp Bizkit or his music, he's a worker in this case. He is working this music festival. And the capitalists behind it decide to try to throw him under the bus because they didn't want to take any blame for all of the horrible decisions they made all around in organizing this event. And really, this isn't just about Woodstock 99. It isn't about introducing more regulation to ensure that all of the issues that we see in this particular event are prevented in the future. Really, what we need to do is think about how workers can take control of not just their working conditions, but of their lives. Because if workers had a seat at the table, or if workers had control and power over their working conditions, then they wouldn't see others as competition for scarce resources. They wouldn't be as alienated as we are now from everything, including the work we do, including alienation from nature, because under a capitalist system, nature is just seen as something to exploit and extract natural resources from, right? We would see the world differently because there would be more to our lives than just producing profit for our bosses. And we would have more control over how much free time we have and what we do with that free time. We wouldn't have to rely on these music festivals or any other event that's put together by people who have a profit motive in order to feel connection to others. We would have the ability to, put some time aside to learn a musical instrument and maybe engage in a jam session if that's what we're interested in. And so we can actually enjoy the music without having corporate control of that experience. And so, yes, I'm not trying to be a Debbie Downer. I'm not trying to be super negative toward some of these events that you guys might actually be in favor of. And that's totally fine. But what I am arguing is that we need to have more control over our free time, how we use that free time, and not allow for others to cater to us in a way that might seem like it's tailored to our needs or our concerns. But more importantly, we need to have more control so people with a profit motive aren't making those decisions for us. And of course, even when it comes to the perfectly fine looking music festivals, they cost a lot of money to go to. What does that say for people who can't afford to go to these events? What does that say for people who want to have a sense of community but literally can't afford to do it because they're underpaid due to the decisions that their bosses make? So the real solution here, Nando, as you know, is for workers to have more control over their workplaces and their lives.
Well, I think the real solution is just because I've just your segment moved me because it was a socialist defense of Limp Bizkit, and I will admit to when I was a young lad at 14 in 1999, I had the Limp Bizkit album. I had the album. I listened to it, and now I feel better about myself because I recognize that Fred Durst, singer of Limp Bizkit, is a worker, and actually, he deserves all the protections that every other worker deserves. So I want to thank you for that, because I think now the solution should be to make him the the vice premier of the Politburo of the new workers state.
I didn't say all that. But but it is kind of funny how it's like, they made all these decisions to price gouge the hell out of people, hold this event at a military base in scorching temperatures, and then it's like, no, it's Limp Bizkit's fault that they rioted. It's Limp Bizkit. Come on.
Yeah. No, I mean, I haven't seen the documentary yet, but I remember that festival well. Like I remember that time really well. I was kind of like really into music throughout the 90s. I remember Woodstock 94 really well, which was also kind of a mess in that it was a huge mudslide, and there's like a whole issue with Green Day. It was like a whole thing also, and they just kind of tried to recapture the magic of Woodstock 1969, which was a completely different era, both politically, but also was before kind of neoliberalism turned everything into like a profit machine, like literally every aspect of society. And by 1999, when neoliberalism was at its absolute peak in terms of its hegemony, they just do like this just grotesque profit grab, and it backfires like right in their face. I find it to be kind of poetic in a way.
Oh, for sure. For sure. And, they were planning on doing another one of these Woodstock festivals in, they announced it in 2019. So I think it was supposed to be held in 2020. It didn't work out. And I don't know, I guess it's one of the silver linings to the pandemic.
Yeah. Do you enjoy going to music festivals in general?
The last time I went to a music festival was in 2014. I did go to Coachella, and I have to admit, I had the time of my life. I did. Okay, so it's not like, oh, I'm not condemning music festivals. I just think that when you allow people with a profit motive to control everything about it, if it started off good, it's easy for it to devolve. And to be short, Coachella has devolved quite a bit. I mean, that's why the last time I went was in 2013 or 2014. I can't remember.
Yeah. No, it's amazing how expensive they are. It's amazing how they profit like at every single turn. There's the case of the water. I mean, this happens in like nightclubs as well, where like everyone's like hopped up on ecstasy and they get dry mouth, and then they just like jack up the prices of the water bottles. And in Spain, actually, like back in the day in the 90s, they used to turn off the water in the bathrooms, like in the sinks. They don't do that anymore because there was like some sort of like intervention from the government. But they used to, like, at these big nightclubs, they would turn off the water in order to force you to buy these like insanely expensive bottles of water when you're like hopped up on E and you got all the dry mouth. So yeah,
that's insane. It shows you though, like they know that you can die. They know that people are hopped up on E, right? They know that people can literally die if they don't have access to water, and they're like, no, we got to make money off of it. We got to exploit the possibility of these people dying to make a buck.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Wow. Well, yeah. All righty. Well, should I get to my segment?
Yes. Tell me what the FBI has been up to, Nando.
Well, a good rule of thumb, Anna, is that you should not trust the FBI. Do not trust the FBI ever. Now, 2020 was a pretty tumultuous year, to say the least. There was, of course, the coronavirus pandemic that froze the global economy for about a year. There was the uprising after the murder of George Floyd, one of the largest mass protests in American history. And then, of course, there was the rise of right-wing militia violence, which culminated with the storming of the Capitol on January 6th. Now, one of the most shocking examples of what is now being called domestic terrorism was when a group of militiamen were arrested in Michigan for allegedly trying to kidnap the governor, Gretchen Whitmer, after she implemented lockdowns in her state.
But we're going to begin tonight with that alleged terror plot and the chilling plan. The FBI says it stopped before it could be carried out. A plan to kidnap Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, and then what they were planning to do to her. 13 suspects arrested, including 7 alleged members of a right-wing militia group. The FBI and state authorities conducting a series of raids in Michigan. Those 13 suspects taken into custody, 7 of them alleged members of that right-wing militia group. Governor Whitmer has been the target of protests since last spring over restrictions aimed to stop the spread of COVID amid one of the early outbreaks. Michigan, of course, a hot spot at the time.
Now, that came in October of 2020, just a few months after armed right-wing protesters entered the Michigan state capitol and occupied it.
Lawmakers in Michigan are taking extra precautions today after the Capitol building was overrun by protesters, some of whom were armed with semi-automatic weapons.
Now, these two events, understandably, freaked people out. But in the months since the arrests, information has come to light that casts serious doubt on the narrative that came out of the FBI and the media. The attorney for at least one of the defendants is alleging that the FBI actually entrapped these men, encouraging and helping them to hatch this conspiracy all along the way.
Members of a group called the Wolverine Watchmen, they responded at anti-lockdown protests at Michigan's Capitol last year, now looking at felony charges of conspiracy to kidnap, but a motion recently filed by defendant Caleb Franks is raising questions around the case. It alleges that the government was working with 12 different confidential sources within the group. His attorney now requesting all information on those informants from the government to better prepare for trial.
Now, of course, the defense attorney is going to try anything to get his client off, but a deeply reported investigation by BuzzFeed News that came out this week seems to corroborate the narrative. It writes, quote, "An examination of the case by BuzzFeed News also reveals that some of these informants, acting under the direction of the FBI, played a far larger role than has previously been reported. Working in secret, they did more than just passively observe and report on the actions of the suspects. Instead, they had a hand in nearly every aspect of the alleged plot, starting with its inception. The extent of their involvement raises serious questions as to whether there would have even been a conspiracy without them." Now you play the video, Kale.
The recent filing also outlines potentially problematic relationships between confidential informants and the FBI, saying one has a, quote, decades-long history of acting as a professional snitch for the government, while pointing out that another received about $54,000 for his cooperation, and a third received an envelope with $2,500 inside.
Now, the fact that there were almost as many federal informants, 12, as men arrested in this whole affair, 13, certainly raises a few eyebrows, especially when you start to read about the informant's role within the whole plot. According to BuzzFeed's report, quote, "A longtime government informant from Wisconsin, for example, helped organize a series of meetings around the country where many of the alleged plotters first met one another and the earliest notions of the plan took root," some of those people say. The Wisconsin informant even paid for some hotel rooms and food as an incentive to get people to come. Then he writes, the Iraq war vet, another informant named Dan, for his part, became so deeply enmeshed in a Michigan militant group that he rose to become its second in command, encouraging members to collaborate with other potential suspects and paying for their transportation to meetings. He prodded the alleged mastermind of the kidnapping plot to advance his plan and then baited the trap that led to the arrest. Now, one of the key parts of the conspiracy was a plan to blow up a bridge in order to prevent law enforcement from reaching the men after they kidnapped the governor. Now, according to BuzzFeed, the man who'd advised them on where to put the explosives and offered to get them as much as the task would require was an undercover FBI agent. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, come on, Nando, this is ridiculous. The FBI could never pull this kind of thing off. These were clearly very bad dudes and they got what they deserved. Thing is, the FBI has a long history of this exact type of behavior. When this whole story broke back in October of 2020, Branko Marcitic at Jacobin published a piece urging people not to buy the media and the FBI's narrative. He wrote a headline that read, "We shouldn't trust the FBI's narrative on the Gretchen Whitmer kidnapping scheme." And then he wrote a subhead that wrote, "The details of the kidnapping plot targeting Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer are disturbing and show the real danger of the far right. But given the FBI's very recent history of using undercover informants as provocateurs to push people into planning terror plots that otherwise would never have happened, we should examine its narrative closely." Branko's main point in the piece is that this all seemed a little too perfect. And he went on to outline several examples of the FBI's, let's say, overzealous prosecution of domestic terrorists, which in the wake of 9/11 were mostly Muslim men who were encouraged to declare loyalty to groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS by the FBI and then arrested for it. One particularly shocking example was the case of Peyton Pruitt, who actually was not Muslim, but was arrested by the FBI for allegedly declaring fealty to ISIS online, despite the fact that he was intellectually disabled.
Peyton Pruitt was arrested last November. He was charged with soliciting support for a terrorist act after staff at a school where Peyton lived noticed some suspect behavior. Peyton had bought a book about ISIS, watched a documentary about ISIS, and communicated with people who appeared to be affiliated with ISIS on social media. Tony Pruitt says all of these things are true. However,
this whole thing, in my opinion, and as well as I know Peyton, was like a video game. I've spoken to him several times about it, and he understands that he did wrong, but his intentions were not to ever hurt anyone.
See, Peyton Pruitt is intellectually disabled.
He has autism and he's mentally retarded with ADD.
This is a copy of one of Peyton's achievement assessments from earlier this year. It shows he has the cognitive ability of an 8-year-old, even though he's 19.
The pain for me was seeing and trying to understand what his mind is going through as an 8-year-old being handcuffed and put in the back of a police car.
Now, the FBI questioned Peyton for hours, encouraging him to forego his right to an attorney, even though he didn't understand what the concept of an attorney even was. Peyton Pruitt was eventually released, but only after spending nearly a year in prison. And another case that was particularly instructive and more similar to what happened in Michigan was the case of the so-called Liberty City 7, which happened in my hometown of Miami at the height of the Bush era.
Well, they're known as the Liberty City 7 after a neighborhood in Miami. The feds say these terror suspects from the Miami area wanted to ignite a guerrilla street war in our country, basically, and bring down the government, put in an Islamic regime. The men reportedly told informants that bombings weren't enough. They wanted to create chaos. Prosecutors say they planned to blow up the Sears Tower in Chicago, the FBI office in Miami, among others, and to even get down to the level of poisoning salt shakers in restaurants.
Not the salt shakers. Now, I remember this case at the time. People in Miami were absolutely freaked out. I mean, there was a total media frenzy at the time, and it was the big story for a while. Well, it turns out the whole thing was just a bunch of BS.
Right. So I'm glad you brought up the case in Florida, which was known as the Liberty City 7 case. And that's actually the case that first alerted me to what was happening. And it was really one of the first cases that the FBI used these sting tactics in a terrorism case. And in that case, I happened to be a reporter down in Miami, and I was there when they announced the charges, which were themselves on its face, on their face, very ridiculous, which was that the FBI accused 7 men who lived in Liberty City, which is a poor African-American and Haitian-American area of Miami, of plotting a ground war against the United States government. Obviously 7 guys can't effectively plot a ground war, yet through this plot, the FBI described how they met an al-Qaeda operative, and that al-Qaeda operative was going to help them bomb the Sears Tower and also the Miami office of the FBI. But on close inspection of that case, it was clear that it wasn't all that it seems. They never had any weapons. All of the weapons would have been provided by the government. They never knew anyone from al-Qaeda. The al-Qaeda operative was actually a paid FBI informant. And they really never had any means or opportunity for committing their crime were it not for the FBI providing everything that they needed. And what also came out was that these men were pretty much idiots. One man, the leader, a man named Narcil Batiste, described how he had hoped to bomb the Sears Tower, and if it fell in such a way, it would hit Lake Michigan and cause a tsunami that would drown the city of Chicago. Obviously, that's patently ridiculous, but it's also indicative of many people who are caught in these sting operations. And so what my research tried to do was look at every terrorism prosecution that had come out of U.S. courts in the decade after 9/11 and try to figure out how many involved really dangerous people and how many involved people like the Liberty City 7 who, were it not for the FBI, would never have been able to commit their crimes. And what I found, I think, was pretty striking, which was that, in the decade after 9/11, there were a handful of cases involving truly dangerous people. Faiza Shahzad, for example, delivered a bomb to Times Square, or Najib al-Azazi tried to detonate bombs on the New York City subway system. Then you have the underwear bomber and the shoe bomber. But except for about 5 defendants, the rest of the cases involved people who were caught in sting operations that, were it not for the FBI, never would have been able to move forward in a terrorist plot. And in the decade after 9/11, 150 people were indicted and convicted who were like the Liberty City 7, who, were it not for the FBI, never could have committed their crimes. And for the most part, these were people on the fringes of Muslim communities, mentally ill, economically desperate, and easily manipulated by FBI informants or undercover agents.
150 people in the decade after 9/11, most of them mentally ill, economically desperate, or easily manipulated by the FBI. But lest you think that this is a recent phenomenon, well, it's not. This is a common tactic going back to the very founding of the FBI. The most famous operation was known as COINTELPRO, in which the FBI infiltrated various left-wing groups with agent provocateurs, who then encouraged infighting as well as acts of violence in order to discredit them. One of the classic examples of this was the case of Afeni Shakur, mother of one Tupac Shakur. She was a Black Panther in the 1970s, and she was also arrested for allegedly plotting to commit acts of terrorism.
One morning, armed police stormed into Afeni Shakur's apartment and arrested her. All the other members of her cell were also arrested. They were charged with what the government said was a giant plan to destroy those elements of society which the defendants call the power structure. It included attacking police stations and planning to bomb 5 large department stores and the Bronx Botanical Gardens. They became known as the Panther 21. Their trial was held in a state of paranoia about further attacks by the Panthers. But it also caused a sensation when it was revealed that 3 of the founding members of the group had been undercover police officers. What was stranger was that some of those officers seemed to have been unaware that there were other undercover agents in the cell. They were also the most active members of the group. "We had to organise everything," one of the undercover agents explained at the trial, because everyone else in the group was off doing what they called their own shit.
They're off doing their own shit. Now, Afeni Shakur ended up representing herself in court for going the right to an attorney and actually won her case by getting the undercover agents to admit that they were the ones orchestrating everything. And when you look at the details of the Michigan plot to kidnap Governor Whitmer, a lot of the same patterns start to emerge. The alleged mastermind of the plot was a guy named Adam Fox, who at the time of the storming of the state capitol, just 6 months before the plot to kidnap the governor was to be executed, he had no ties to any militant groups whatsoever. Fox was living with his dogs in the basement of a friend's vacuum repair shop, the Vac Shack, in Grand Rapids. Lacking long-term employment, he smoked weed and spent hours on Facebook looking to make connections with other members of the Patriot community who felt angry at a government they felt had failed them, according to his fiancée at the time, Amanda Keller. Fox's main outlet was Pumping Iron. Keller, who was with him on April 30th, said she had thought of Fox as a teddy bear, but his mood changed overnight when Whitmer, as part of her stay-at-home order, closed all the gyms in the state. Now, after the riot at the Michigan State Capitol, Fox got more involved in the Wolverine Watchman group, often with the outright encouragement of the federal informant named Dan, the former Iraq War veteran. Quote, stopping violent ideas like this was what Dan said drove him to law enforcement in the first place. But now, with his 2 FBI agents at his side, he told Fox he would help. Hey, man, Dan said, if you want to come and train at Joe's sometime with us, that would be great. Dude, we are down to fucking train, brother, for sure, Fox replied. But as the weeks went on, Fox's behavior got stranger and stranger to the point where he started to freak out other members of the group. Quote, listening to him that night, Beller, one of the watchmen, became convinced that Fox was out of his mind and repeatedly shared those concerns with Dan, court testimony shows. Morrison, the group's commanding officer, also expressed reservations about Fox. But Dan used his growing influence to include Fox in group meetings and to develop his own personal relationship with him. Fox, in turn, began referring to Dan as his brother, according to Fox's former fiancée. So this guy, Dan, a federal informant, was doing his best to keep the increasingly unhinged Fox in the group's good graces. And then, a few weeks later, Dan drove 5 watchmen and 6,000 rounds of ammunition to Cambria, Wisconsin for a national training exercise. He rented a Suburban for the weekend, paid for gas, and subsidized food and lodging for the group, all courtesy of the FBI. So you start to see the dynamic here. There's definitely a seed of bad behavior amongst groups like these, but often it's the FBI itself that pours water on that seed and provides the necessary nutrients for that seed to grow. Without the FBI's help, maybe these guys would have just been annoying assholes who cosplay with guns and post memes on Facebook all day. But back to the original storming of the Michigan State Capitol, which was a sort of preview of the storming of the national Capitol in D.C. on January 6th. Our good friend Dan was in the thick of that as well. In fact, he did his best to try to warn the FBI that this was going down. Quote, panic rising, Dan slipped away from the group for a moment and spoke into the recording device he was carrying, which he knew was being monitored live by his FBI handlers. The watchmen, he said, were preparing to breach the Capitol. The agents couldn't speak back to him, but he hoped they could at least warn the police about what was coming. But then something surprising happened. The Michigan State Police stood down and let the protesters, including those in full tactical gear, enter the building unopposed. They could even bring their guns so long as they submitted to a temperature check for COVID-19. Now, that seems strange, doesn't it? At the time, it was seen as evidence that the state police forces were just sympathetic to the right-wing militia cause and let them walk right in. But as Branko Marcitic points out in a piece this week for Jacobin, this kind of thing, just like the Fed's behavior before the January 6th riot, are the perfect pretext to expand the state security forces' power. He writes, speaking of January 6th, there remains serious questions about law enforcement agencies' conduct on that day. The security and intelligence failure, which was the only reason the Stop the Steal protest was able to get out of hand and charge into the Capitol, still hasn't been adequately explained. Besides contradictory testimony from officials about the failure of their response, we know the FBI and others warned the Capitol Police in advance about the protests. We now also know that there was at least one undercover agent among the rioters, on top of the fact that the leader of the Proud Boys, one of the far-right groups who took part in the incident, was a prolific law enforcement informant. In the words of his own lawyer, and at least 4 Proud Boy leaders in total were feeding information to the Bureau since 2019, directly contradicting the FBI director's sworn testimony earlier this year. Why, given all this, did law enforcement fail so spectacularly to keep a mostly unarmed crowd of protesters out of the Capitol, particularly after the police's militarized and heavy-handed response to the anti-police brutality protests over the past 6 years? How were they taken by surprise when the entire event was planned in the open anyway? Why have law enforcement officials offered inconsistent, contradictory, and even misleading testimony? All good questions the national press has been largely uninterested in, obsessed instead with debunking overcooked claims that the FBI organized the riot. None of this points to a deliberate conspiracy, but it certainly seems like the two principal events upon which a dangerous new domestic war on terror has been launched off of are, first, a kidnapping plot that only existed because the FBI made it happen, and second, a completely avoidable security failure by law enforcement that was asleep at the wheel. In other words, it points to a classic national security dynamic, agencies overzealously prosecuting national security threats or royally screwing up, and instead of admitting to the mistakes, using the incidents to justify more power and resources for themselves. And what are the concrete effects of this? Well, a more powerful and unaccountable security state. Just like the spate of laws that were passed after 9/11 that allowed the government to essentially spy on everyone, in the wake of January 6th, left-wing lawmakers facilitated the passage of a bill funneling enormous amounts of money and resources to the Capitol Police, which has now alarmingly been expanded into a national anti-terrorism police force, one that's conveniently exempt from the Freedom of Information Act. Now, this was always going to be the end game. In the 60s and 70s, the government preyed on people's fears of left-wing revolutionary groups. In the aughts, it was all about jihadist terrorism. Now, in the wake of Trump, the boogeyman is these right-wing militias, which isn't to say that they are great guys by any stretch of the imagination. But one just has to do a simple power analysis to evaluate the gravity of their threat. As often comes out months after people have moved on from the story, it was the FBI itself who played up the threat. And it's not like these FBI agents are great guys either. In fact, the lead special agent in the case of the kidnapping plot, a guy named Richard Trask, is now facing criminal charges of his own, accused of smashing his wife's head against the nightstand and choking her at her home in Kalamazoo County's Ashtempo Township on July 18th, according to a criminal complaint filed this week. On the day of the attack, Trask and his wife drank alcohol while attending a swingers party at a hotel, and she didn't like the event, and couple fought on the way home, according to an affidavit in support of the charges against Trask. In their bedroom at home, the wife was laying down when Trask got on top of her and grabbed the sides of her head, the affidavit said. Trask smashed her head into a nearby nightstand multiple times. Then Trask's wife then tried to grab Trask's beard to get him off of her, but he started to choke her. The affidavit said the woman told police she doesn't think she lost consciousness before she grabbed Trask's testicles, ending the fight. So the bottom line is, don't trust the FBI's narrative when it says it has foiled a dangerous terrorist plot. The incentives on a micro level are for personal career advancement. That's obvious. And on the macro level, they are more power to the FBI. The FBI has orchestrated domestic terror plots for decades in order to play up its own vital role. The media often runs with the story immediately rather than waiting to evaluate evidence and questioning the narrative. Next time, we should be more cautious, and we should watch for the predictable effects of playing up fears of terrorism, whether foreign or domestic. It never ends well.
What I hate is that this just provides more fodder for conspiracy theorists and stuff, right? Like, and people who don't trust our institutions because they have good reason to not trust institutions. And so it's so counterproductive. It's awful. I mean, yes, there are the ramifications that you perfectly outlined regarding, the security state, more surveillance, more interference in our day-to-day lives that violate our privacy rights and all of that, our civil liberties. But then there's also it's all interconnected, right? When you look at the more insane conspiracy theorists or theories that are out there, or like QAnon's a good example, I think, right? It's so hard to counter that with evidence because they don't trust the institutions that are trying to provide evidence counter to what they believe. So it keeps getting worse. And I don't know what the solution is really. Because are we going to stop the FBI from doing what the FBI does? I mean, if the FBI wanted to keep an eye on things because there's a group of people who might be on their own planning some sort of terrorist threat in the US, that makes sense. But planting a seed, or literally like planning the plot themselves and then shifting that blame onto any group of people, is not what the FBI is supposed to be doing. That doesn't keep anyone safe. What it does is it makes it appear as though they're doing their jobs and they're effective at it. I think that's part of what motivates them. But also, yes, I think it provides the excuse to violate civil liberties and encroach on our freedoms.
Yeah, I mean, it's not dissimilar to when you see kind of news happening around the world that kind of benefits the national security state, that comes from sources in the national security state that are like, a good example is one that we always talk about. That's kind of like our hobby horse, which is the Russian bounty in Afghanistan story, which came out and everyone was like, oh my God, can you believe this? Can you believe this? And like, obviously all the sourcing was just like, high level people in the Pentagon and stuff like that. And it's like, this is so obviously like a plant into the media in order to justify, our staying in Afghanistan, to justify, whatever belligerence towards Russia, and like a million things that kind of benefit the national security state. And then the media is just like, whoa, wow, look, this is happening. We just run with it, and then people like read it and then they believe it. That's what drives me crazy about all of this stuff, is that like we should never trust government sources. Like they're self-interested just like anyone else. But the media is very, very obsequious towards government sources. They especially like the cable news and all these. It's like if the government is saying it, they believe it wholesale, and you just can't believe it. You just can't believe it.
Well, yeah, and going back to the point about everything being connected. Why does the media just believe what government sources have to say, rather than being incredibly skeptical of their sources? Well, it goes back to the profit motive behind media, which is why the fairness doctrine was so incredibly important, right? They want access to these sources because access to these sources definitely plays a role in the reporting. They're able to say, oh, we got the scoop, right? And that allows them to increase the readership or the viewership of their content and make a profit. Like it always goes back to the profit motive. So, and they don't want to destroy their contacts or their relationship with these sources. And so they'll do this like incredibly weak, flimsy reporting that carries out manufactured narratives that manufacture the consent for wars that we shouldn't be engaged in.
Yeah, no, and in the case of this latest stuff coming out of from the FBI and all these right-wing groups, again, it's not dissimilar to like radical Islamic terrorism or whatever. Like there is like a seed of truth there. Like it's not like completely just a total fiction. Like there are right-wing very dangerous militia groups out there, and they're not people that I want to be around, or and but like you have to try as best you can to have a little perspective on it, because when it becomes this kind of big media frenzy, then the response is always like, well, we got to do something about it. And the tools available to do something about it are always the same. They're just an expansion of the security state's power. That's just that like I remember like talking to Bessner about it, like the day after the January 6th thing happened, and he was like, this is what's going to happen. Like it is like this is what happened. Like because we have so much historical precedent to lean on. It's just the same thing over and over again. It's much like when you hear about like some media story about some attack on American soldiers and abroad, like whether it was the Gulf of Tonkin or whether it was like a million other things where it's just used as a casus belli to go to war. And you got to question those things because over time, what always ends up coming out is that these things were exaggerated or they didn't happen or they were orchestrated by the military itself. I mean, that's the reality of this. And with the case of January 6th, which like it happened, it was so obvious that something was going to happen. I mean, they were like talking about it openly on Facebook and on social media in the weeks leading up to it, and yet they did nothing about it. They did, it was just allowed to happen. And again, you look at it's like that scene in Lebowski. It's like Lenin said. You ask who benefits, cui bono, or whatever, and all of a sudden the Capitol Police is getting increased funding and vast sweeping powers to do this like national anti-terrorism police force, and by the way, exempt from the Freedom of Information Act. Great. Ken Klippenstein can't even look into their shit.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the January 6th situation it's frustrating because they're obviously not organized and don't really have a real strategy or plan in place, but their motives were clear. And what they were attempting to do was clear. And had they gotten to the same room that lawmakers were in, who knows what would have happened, right? Mm-hmm. So there's that. But at the same time, yes, deal with people who have broken the law, sure. But more importantly, on the day that happened, right before the riots, you have Congressman Mo Brooks, giving a speech, partially inciting what happened. And, he was interviewed by the Slate and he stupidly admitted that he was wearing a bulletproof vest. He was wearing body armor. Why were you wearing body armor unless you were expecting violence to break out? And if you were expecting violence to break out, why did you give the kind of speech that you did? You get what I'm So I bring that up because I want people in positions of power to be held accountable for what they did, for their encouragement of what happened in the Capitol that day. And right now, we keep hearing about this select committee to investigate what happened. They're so hyper-focused on the perpetrators, like the people who stormed the Capitol. But there's very little conversation about the lawmakers who lied to the American people for weeks leading up to that, right? Lying to the American people about what actually happened or transpired in the 2020 election. And then some of those people are involved in the investigation. How insane is that? Like the whole thing is insane. And so for anyone who wants like justice or more importantly, like justice is one thing. I just don't want it to happen again. Right? Yeah. But if you want to prevent that from happening again, you need to get to the heart of the issue. And I don't see anyone in Congress focused on that at all.
No, they're not. And like you said, I mean, like, the QAnon shaman is a patsy. Like he's just such an obvious dumbass, and all these people, like a bunch of people are going to go to jail and whatever. They're they're awful people, whatever. But the actual root causes are not going to be addressed, and then the effects, the long-term effects, are going to be incredibly negative. I mean, it's the same. It's a version of what happened after 9/11. Like obviously what happened after 9/11 was much graver, but it's a version of the same exact dynamic in which like we were just focused on the wrong thing. We were just absolutely focused on the wrong thing. We were not focused on the root causes, and then our response to it was insanely overblown and not addressing any of the root causes. Instead, focusing the brunt of it on innocent people, on and expanding the state's power to do all kinds of previously illegal stuff, while also doing a lot of currently illegal stuff, but then not prosecuting the state on any of that stuff, whether it was torture or illegal rendition or things like that. And so versions of like that are going to happen because these people are so obviously unsavory. I mean, if you watch the video of these like right-wing militia guys, like they're insane and they're awful. I hate that. But they're such an easy thing to serve up. you know, and we're like, it's so tempting for us to lap it up, to be like, oh yeah, just throw, you know, like get those guys, you know, like do whatever it takes, you know, like get those guys out of here. But like we have to try to exhibit a little bit of self-control and caution and be like, what's really going on here? Who benefits? You know, what are the root causes and what are the likely predictable effects?
Yeah, I mean, I wish that there was a way to focus on actual content. When I talk about holding people accountable in regard to January 6th, I'm talking about the politicians who did this, right? Who like just nonstop provocative speeches, nonstop lies, you know, encouraging them to do what they did. There's no conversation about consequences for them. In fact, the only time they're part of the conversation is, well, are they going to be good team players in investigating the Capitol riots? Why do you want the people who provoked the Capitol riots to be part of the investigation in the Capitol riots? Like, it just makes no sense. And that's honestly part of the problem with the Democratic Party, right? Like Nancy Pelosi putting like Liz Cheney on the select committee. She was one of the people that Pelosi appointed, and like bragging about how this is going to be a bipartisan effort, everyone. We wouldn't want this to appear political. No, but the whole point of the select committee in the way that it's being carried out is only political. It's not really about getting to the bottom of everything. And that's frustrating for someone who actually wants the very people in positions of power to be held accountable for what they did.
Yeah.
Anyway, well, you know, let's lighten the mood a little bit. Hear from a very wise person, Dr. Cornel West, who we interviewed earlier in the week. So we're going to go to the interview in just a minute. But for those of you watching live, I just want to encourage you to send in your super chats, because we're going to save a few minutes toward the end of the show to answer your questions, read your comments. So as you're watching, maybe you have some feedback on the interview itself, feel free to send us super chats and we'll respond to them when we come back in about, I think, 45 minutes. So we'll see you then. Joining us now is Dr. Cornel West, someone who we've been really looking forward to having a conversation with, especially post the 2020 election. Dr. West, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. I salute both of you, and I especially salute Jacobin magazine. It's the best leftist magazine out there. But you know, we do begin on a very sad note with the death of Bob Moses, one of the great freedom fighters of the 60s all the way into the 21st century. Glenn Ford, founder of Black Agenda Report. He's one of the great journalists, really builds on the legacy of Ida B. Wells more than most others. And then also near death is Don Shriver, who was a giant in theological education, who facilitated James Cone, the founder of Black Liberation Theology at Union Theological Seminary. And even my new chair, Dietrich Bonhoeffer chair, Don Shriver and Peggy Shriver made the contribution for that chair. And so to have all three of them gone and near gone is a heavy, very heavy moment, at least for me. You know? I'm sure for you all as well.
Yeah, you know, as you say that, it just goes perfectly with the question that I've been really desperate to ask you, because I'm struggling right now in terms of where the left is post 2020 election. You know, you talk about these great leaders and how they're no longer with us. And sometimes things can feel a little hopeless. And so I wanted to ask you, you know, you've always had this sense of optimism, and I think it's a huge part of who you are. It's a huge part of your fight. Where do you find that hope from?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. Well, I mean, as a blues man in the life of the mind and jazz man in the world of ideas, I've never been either a pessimist or an optimist. I'm a prisoner of hope. And hope is as much a verb as it is a virtue. And therefore, very much like Jacobin magazine, I have to stay in motion. I can't be a spectator. I've got to be a participant, engaged in movement, motion, momentum, organizing, as well as the reading, reflecting, and writing. And as long as you're in the funk and in the mess of the movement, then the hope is found in seeing people refusing to give up seeing people fight, seeing people serve others, seeing people sacrifice for something bigger than them. And as long as you're part of that motion and movement, that's where the hope is found. So in that sense, hope is as much an effect of action, probably more than it is a cause of action in that regard. I mean, for me, you know, I don't even believe so much in the language of hope. You know, it's just a matter of trying to be a hope. And if you are a hope, you don't talk about hope. You know, hope's too abstract. It's too abstract. If your hope in the fleshified sense, the concretized sense, the actualized sense of being part of movements, organizing, mobilizing, then you're forever able to move with others in solidarity here and around the world, oppressed people in every corner of the globe who are fighting. And you look in their eyes, you look in their hearts, you look in their minds, you see that sparkle, you see that fire, you see that strength, and you say, shoot, I got to keep on moving. I have to be part of this. But keep in mind, last but not least, you know, Goethe says, he who has never despaired has never lived. And there is no hope without despair. We're wrestling with despair all the time. That's a sign that we're sensitive to suffering. That's a sign that we're trying to reflect on the suffering, to try to alleviate the suffering with our social analysis and with our social practice.
Yeah, it's to me what I always appreciate about hearing you speak on any show or any platform or read your work is that you constantly tie it to something bigger, a bigger struggle. And I find that that's what really gives life meaning, is to surrender yourself to a struggle that is bigger than yourself, which is something that's very difficult in the modern time, which everything is catered to our own personal whims in the moment, you know, as a consumer. And it really negates our ability to attach ourselves to something that's bigger than ourselves. And to me, the thing that really provides that for me is to be able to zoom back and look at things with a perspective of history. And we live in a moment of one of the most bitter defeats for the left.
Right.
But often in those defeats in the past, there has been a sort of darkness before the light moment. I would like to hear your thoughts as to where we are. The Bernie Sanders campaigns of 2016 and 2020 were unimaginable 10 years before, or even 4 years before. And now that seems like it has opened some avenues of possibility that were denied to us in the dark period of the early 2000s or the 90s or things like that. Where are you thinking right now in terms of where we are?
Right, no, I appreciate that. One just brief point though about transcendence, trying to be connected to something bigger than us. Rabbi Heschel used to say that we've got to be connected to something that calls us to serve and sacrifice that's larger than us.
Yeah.
But the problem is the market has colonized the dominant form of transcendence. So people who've got careers, opportunism, just market-driven conception of transcendence. So that success, financial prosperity, status, spectacle, celebrity, all those are market forms of colonizing transcendence. And I mean, leftists in all of our varieties, we're calling for non-Marxist forms of transcendence. It could be moral, it could be spiritual, it could be political. It's something bigger than us. It's solidarity, it's justice, it's freedom, it's democracy, equality. And the only way you can concretize that is to sustain different networks, different matrices, different organizations and structures that are countervailing forces against the market-driven forms of transcendence. And that's true for just market-driven forms of universities, market-driven forms of civic institutions, and so forth. So that becomes a launching pad into looking at the grimness of our own moment. because it's true that, I mean, my God, just, 12 months ago, we had hundreds of thousands of people on the street with Black Lives Matter. And that is inseparable from Bernie Sanders' campaign, going back to Occupy, feminist movements highlighting the Me Tooism, anti-homophobic movements bringing to bear the kind of dignity for the gay brothers and lesbian sisters and queers and trans and non-binary precious folk, so that the voices are still there. It's just that the imperial structure, but the empire is just so decadent.
Mm-hmm.
And the wonderful piece that I read on the ruling class by our dear brother, was it Doug, was it?
Doug Henwood.
Yeah, I highly recommend folk to read that. And you can just see the level of decay of the ruling classes. So that it's just the outright unleashing of gangsterization. And they've always been barbaric. But some barbarians still have certain kinds of constraints. Whereas now the gangsterization of the empire with a ruling class so decayed that it's very difficult for social movements to have impact on elites who are gangsters. I mean, hypocrisy is a tribute that vice pays the virtue. So you're a hypocrite, at least you still have standards. Where we've got ruling class now, it has no standards at all whatsoever. So you can't even call them hypocrites because the gap between virtue and vice is no longer important. They don't care. That's what greed run amok is. And so dealing with that, there's a sense in which we're glad that we have as many voices, organizations, journals on the left in some ways. And when you think back of, where we were, let's say when I was you all's age, let's say, now you all age, I mean, Reaganism was running amok. The neoliberalism was already taking off. The imperial militarism was running amok. Mm-hmm. Martin was dead. Malcolm was dead. SDS was pushed to the side. The students were more and more filtering to a mainstream rather than listening to what C. Wright Mills had talked about, what Tom Hayden had talked about, what Barbara Ehrenreich was talking about. Getting that mainstreaming and streamlining of the young students in the knowledge factories, which became so tied to big donors, big beneficiaries, big money, and then investing in South Africa. We can go on and on. So there's a sense in which we can acknowledge just how dim things are, but also acknowledge that in the dimness, you've got some folks still fighting with tremendous energy and quality.
I know that's incredibly inspiring. And that's honestly where I try to draw strength from, because you're right about those moments of despair. It's part of being human. It's part of, actually caring about this struggle and being involved in it. But, one of the other things that comes to mind is you mentioned the Reagan era. When I think of the Reagan era, I really think about, the neoliberal era of America taking off. And now there's a lot more critique and criticism of neoliberalism, which is a good sign. But I think back at the Reagan era and, when you look at the debate that he had with George H.W. Bush on immigration, it sounded like two liberals debating each other on immigration. And you see how our discourse on certain issues has actually been regressing over the last few decades. You look at the open and overt hatred that's spewed on literally news outlets today, and the lack of any type of shame in that kind of discourse or rhetoric. And so, you mentioned how we have made some progress, But there's also this underlying system that we're all trying to fight under. And that system has the incentives in the wrong place, right? It incentivizes people in many cases to kind of abandon the fight for equality, whether it be on social issues or economic issues, for personal gain, personal interests. And honestly, when you think about the need for survival, you almost can't even blame people for doing that. But how do we mitigate that? How do we prevent it from happening?
Yeah, but I mean, all we have is our traditions and each other, which is to say our movements. So we have to be able to generate sources of insight and sources of inspiration. You need both simultaneously. The insight has to flow from the quality of our social and historical analysis. So that, for example, I mean, to go back to Reaganism versus Trumpism, how do you account for the neo-fascist turn? How do you account for the rawness of the atavism, the rawness of the hatred, the rawness of the contempt? It was already there in Reagan's movement, but it was not as raw. Well, there you have a collapse of a Republican Party. You have a collapse of a certain kind of conservatism that was tied to traditional values, fiscal tightness, suspicion of federal government, and so forth and so on. The underlying common denominator was allegiance to big capital and money, allegiance to militarism abroad, and deeply white supremacists and male supremacists, and also anti-Jewish and anti-homophobic. But the neo-fascist version is different. There's no doubt about it, and that's the rawness of it, you see. And, in different places, I mean, in Portugal and Spain and Argentina and Chile and so forth, they've had neo-fascists who have been part of their public life for a long time. Whereas in the United States now, other than Black folk dealing with white supremacy, which has its own neo-fascist effects, that most Americans are not used to having neo-fascists in public life. So explicit, so raw in their hatred and contempt for those cast as other. So we have to provide insight, historical analysis, and social analysis so people can actually see more clearly what's going on. But they also have to be fired up. That's where the inspiration comes in. And that's where the sense, you can't be Pollyannish, you can't be Disneylandish. We're just going to turn the corner and we have a revolution. No. These are some thugs running things. They will kill your mama. They will lie on you. They will send you to jail. They will crush you. They will undercut your career. They'll do anything. And that's what neo-fascists historically have done across national boundaries. Though each neo-fascism has its historical, specifically different qualities relative to context and relative to the nation state and the economy at a particular moment in any history you see. So, but it's that seeing and that being in movement, that insight and the inspiration that we need. And that's another reason why Jacobin magazine is so very important. Because people are hungry and thirsty, looking for the real thing. This is what Brother Glenn Ford and I spent so much time. And that's why I love that brother so and miss him so. The Black Agenda Report, he's out there all by himself with Margaret and Ajamu and a few others. And what is he doing? Let's keep track on the decadence of the Black bourgeoisie. Let's keep track of the decadence of Black neoliberal leadership that's leading Black folks suffering so incessantly on every level, psychic, political, economic, leading folk into a dead end. That's the Obama mania and all that other mess, you see. Well, Glenn was carrying the Black Agenda Report, just like Jacobin, carrying the truth-telling and the justice-seeking against that kind of mainstream hegemonic way of looking at America and Black America. And in the end, more and more people recognize it, Brother Glenn was right. Sister Margaret's right. Brother John will tend to be more right than we thought. Jacobin's right about these things. I'll be dang, they seem so far out. They seem so outside of the mainstream. You don't say, because that mainstream is so truncated. You remember this wonderful line from Henry James and Robert Louis Stevens on January 12th, I think it was 1901. He says, no theory is kind to us that cheats us of seeing. No theory is kind to us that cheats us of seeing. So neo-fascist visions, neoliberal visions, they cheat us of seeing. You can't see the suffering. You can't see the structures. You can't see the institutions. You can't see the forms of solidarity that are fighting it. So that if people are locked into neoliberal corporate media, they're not going to see too much.
Yeah.
They're locked into Fox News, they're not going to see too much. And where do you get the broader, comprehensive analysis that allows people to see and then be inspired? That's the real challenge right now. And that's why we've got to become even more fortified in sustaining institutions like Jacobin.
Yeah. You mentioned the black bourgeoisie, and there was an article in Jacobin that looked at the victory of India Walton in Buffalo for mayor, and she actually did better in neighborhoods that were white and Latino than in her own neighborhood, which was heavily black. And I found that interesting. This a black nurse, radical socialist who wins. On primarily a white and Latino voting base, while her neighborhood, which is heavily black, voted against her. And similar thing happened with Bernie. What's the dynamic there? The sort of credibility of the black bourgeoisie with a lot of black voters to deliver, frankly, conservative political outcomes, even though when you poll black Americans, they're some of the most left people on every issue in the country. How does that dynamic work?
Yeah, both y'all asked such wonderful questions. I'm telling you, but it just reconfirms what I'm saying about.
I'm going to clip that. Yeah.
But no, I think it's important to keep the context in mind that you see with Bob Moses and Martin King, Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Baker, and the Rabbi Heschel and the Tom Haydens, because it was a multiracial movement in the 60s, breaking the back of American apartheid, breaking the back of the old Jim Crow. And it produced two major results. One was the new Jim Crow, which was the mass incarceration of the black masses, the black poor and working class. And then there was the mass incorporation of the black middle classes. And with so many of the radical leaders assassinated or incarcerated, it meant then that liberal and neoliberal black leadership was viewed as the vanguard of the black freedom movement. Mm. And so with Brother Barack Obama, you get the height of success in the American empire. He's running the whole empire. Well, that's a major shadow cast. Now, what did he do about the new Jim Crow and the mass incarceration? What did he do about the unbelievable class collapse in terms of schools and education and healthcare and housing for the black masses? Now, he made it worse. Mm-hmm. He made it worse because he went with Wall Street. He bailed out Wall Street. But the model of black success became that black presidency. And so the black politicians imitate and emulate his neoliberal politics, thinking that's the way to win elections. That's what we ran up against with Brother Bernie. How can we account for the fact that the most progressive presidential candidate in the 20th century was not supported by the most progressive voting bloc in America, namely the black voting bloc. Why? Because the Obama shadow was cast so deeply that we, myself, and Nina Turner, and Danny Glover, and a host of black folk, we could not push effectively against that Obama shadow, that Obama effect, which goes back to the mass incorporation of especially the black middle classes into liberal and neoliberal politics and into being well adjusted to an unjust empire and well adapted to an indifferent set of elites, no matter what color they are.
Mm-hmm.
So to make the elites more colorful, more black, more brown, keep the empire in place, keep the predatory capitalist system in place, and things will be better. I mean, that's part of the neoliberal message. So that what is happening now, I'm on my way for Sister Nina Turner running in Cleveland. We got the election coming up on Tuesday. I'm going to spend 5 days there with her. We're going to do 12 events every day the way we did with Bernie, right? And Bernie's going to be there too. God bless her. Bernie will be there too on Saturday at the rally, trying to deal with a moribund, milquetoast, neoliberal, corporate-dominated Democratic Party that has progressives on its edges. But most of the energy of the party is found among the progressives. It's found with the Quad and so forth. And Nina Turner is a major voice figure, brilliant, visionary politician wrestling with that dilemma, as it were, and it's a very, very tough race. So that the sad thing in conclusion is that there's a sleepwalking, there's a neoliberal sleepwalking among black leadership that has tremendous impact on black voters. And keep in mind that probably the majority of black folk don't vote at all, because that's another kind of statement, right? Another kind of expression in and of itself. But things are shifting now. Things are shifting. I know in my own work, 10 years ago, I used to have black folks say, you have lost your mind, critical of the black president. You ought to be shaming yourself. I'll go back to these same contexts, these same sites, and they'll say, I called you everything but a child of God, but I see you were telling the truth. I said, well, I've been saying the same thing.
Yeah, I remember that. I remember that very well. Yeah.
You mentioned Nina Turner and the congressional race for Ohio's 11th district. And I do want to talk about that a little bit because, there wasn't really much attention paid to that race until it was very clear that Nina Turner was in fact going to win the Democratic primary there. That was when Hillary Clinton got involved and gave the endorsement. And I don't think anybody's really excited about a Hillary Clinton endorsement, but what that came along with was a lot of corporate cash. And you mentioned Senator Bernie Sanders and how he's planning on, rallying for Nina, which is wonderful. But on the other side, with Shontel Brown, who's the neoliberal candidate who's up against Nina Turner, you have Representative Jim Clyburn, who's going to be doing some campaigning for her. I bring him up because he has certainly gone out of his way to carry out the best interests of Joe Biden. And Joe Biden has turned around and, failed to deliver anything that Clyburn had wanted, really. They're not going to do away with the filibuster. Biden isn't calling for the Senate to do away with the filibuster, which essentially stalls any important legislation that Clyburn or any other Democrat might want. So what's your response to that? And what do you think the influence of corporate money in that election is likely to do?
Well, indeed. One, that there is an increasing conflict and cleavage between black neoliberals and white neoliberals like Biden or Kamala Harris, who's on Biden's side. Because by Biden's refusal to hit the filibuster head on so that voting rights suppression is somehow secondary and tertiary, for neoliberal black politicians, voting rights is number one. Now, it's still too narrow, it's still too truncated, but voting rights still are very important. And so you're getting more and more tension between Biden and his black neoliberal supporters. You can see it even on in the media and so forth. The critique of Biden. Now, it's not a structural critique. It's not a leftist critique. It's just that Biden's making it very clear that he's not going to touch the filibuster. And if you don't touch the filibuster, you are allowing the shadow of Jim Crow within the political sphere to expand. And neoliberal black politicians can't put up with that. Not at all. Now, exactly where that will go is an open question, because in the situation of Cleveland, Ohio, 11, where you have Nina Turner, who is a bona fide progressive, who is very critical of Biden, not just when it comes to his refusal to hit the filibuster head on, but also his allegiance to Wall Street, his allegiance to the Pentagon, his promoting of predatory capitalism and the militarism abroad, a broader critique within the electoral political system. She then gets targeted by corporate money, as you rightly say, tied to the Hillary endorsement, you see. She gets targeted by those concerned about her being critical of American militarism, not just in Africa and Latin America, but in the Middle East. So you get a lot of our deeply neoliberal and right-wing Jewish brothers and sisters in their uncritical defense of Israel, pouring big money in. And once you get that kind of coming together of neoliberals against a genuine progressive like Nina Turner, then it becomes very clear who's on which side, because it's not just Clyburn, it's the whole Black Congressional Caucus. I mean, most of the Black Congressional Caucus have come out for the neoliberal candidates. And I was glad to see AOC and a few others come out for Nina, and we want to see even more, we hope, this weekend. But it just, again, allows us to see more clearly, who is allied with whom when it comes to the three fundamental sources we must always highlight: Wall Street, Pentagon, and xenophobic ideologies and sensibilities. White supremacists, male supremacists, anti-Jewish, anti-Muslim, anti-Arab, homophobic, and patriarchal.
You mentioned the uprisings that were just 12 months ago, and they seem like forever ago at this point. But the two largest sort of street demonstrations of my lifetime were the anti-Iraq war protests and the protests that emerged after the murder of George Floyd. And it strikes me that, in both cases, they were huge and all over the streets, but and in both cases, the Iraq war raged on, and the racism of the criminal justice system rages on as well. But the difference in the reaction from the power structures to them, to me, are quite striking, in that the Iraq war protests were successfully marginalized by corporate and government power structures to make them look like ridiculous fringe people, even though there was millions of people on the street. With George Floyd protests, we've seen a sort of absorption of the energy by corporate America. Mm-hmm. And it's almost commoditized a certain language about race, that a certain radical language around race that has become okay to be used within the context of, say, like a JP Morgan ad, or Raytheon doing race trainings in their corporate retreats. I was just curious what your reaction to that phenomenon has been.
Yeah, I mean, one, you're always going to get a very different reaction to imperial militarism than you are domestic racism. Because in the latter, you can't talk about American culture without talking about Black culture. You see, the whole nation has been Afro-Americanized when it comes to culture, when it comes to music. Music's a dominant form of transcendence in late capitalist civilization, especially for young people, you see. So that you have to hit that in some way head on. And that's part of the mass incorporation I was talking about. You got to absorb it. You got to dilute the radical demands in order to get people to adapt and adjust to a status quo. So it becomes what I call, I mean, I talk about this in terms of my own Harvard situation, where you bring in the Black professors, you make them the public face of your institution, but it looks like you're so multicultural, looks like you're so concerned about racism, diversity, equity, inclusion is the words you use over and over and over again. And it ends up just Jim Crow new style under market conditions in professional managerial context. Because in terms of who actually makes the most fundamental decisions, in terms of who is accountable to whom, it's still very much a white supremacist affair. It's still very much a white supremacist male affair in some ways. Even though you can make it more gender inclusive too, and keep the hierarchy in place, keep the oppressive structure still in place. And corporations have to do the same thing. So the first thing you begin with symbolic gestures. Oh my God, we've hired 3 Black folk in the last week. Oh my God, we've changed the name of monuments. Oh my God, we've got our commercials now with Black faces. Don't you see us responding? Oh my, we're undergoing a revolution here. Let's have a party. Let's celebrate diversity. Please get off the crack pipe. Spare me. We're talking about sharing of power in structures. That's democratizing. They're talking about racially, multiracially commodified is not the same as power sharing in forms of democratized. Very different things. Very different things. And so I think you're right that the protests have opened up new opportunities for Black middle class jobs, just like they opened up new opportunities for certain Black professors. But then the question becomes, if it's Jim Crow new style, what does that mean? Are you going to respect the professors who are there? How long are the new folk in corporate America really going to last? How high will they go? If they go to the top, will they have already so thoroughly reshaped and refashioned themselves in the corporate elites that they might as well be white anyway? In terms of their actions and behaviors, in terms of how they spend their money and deploy their power and so forth. See, those are the kind of questions that are very important, not just for leftists, because I think we have to be very, very honest and bold about our leftist vision analysis. It's not just a leftist analysis, it's a quest for the truth. Mm-hmm. And the condition of truth is to allow suffering to speak. The Negro National Anthem is lift every voice. That's a democratic spirit. Every voice must be lifted. You got all these masses of voices out here that are not heard. Poor and working class. You're not lifting. You're not listening to those voices. They're not choosing poverty. They're not choosing jobs that don't have a living wage. They're not choosing indecent housing. They're not choosing unavailable health care. They're not choosing what these schools look like, so decrepit and so forth. So their voices are not being heard. And so in that sense, that's for me, and you all know, my own revolutionary Christian view about this thing is that it's leftist in terms of being on an ideological spectrum, but I'm concerned about the truth. I'm concerned about justice. I'm concerned about goodness. I'm concerned about beauty. Prince produced some beautiful music. He got his new album dropping today, right? Welcome to America. You all know the story about how he and I had this debate about, I said, Prince, you my dear brother, you a genius, but you ain't no Curtis Mayfield. So he went in the studio and made some Curtis Mayfield music, Born to Die. Sound just like Moments in Superfly, part of his genius. But he's concerned about truth and beauty and goodness. He just happens to land with a leftist critique of a decaying American empire shot through with greed and hatred and that vicious form of white supremacy that so often are isolated from predatory capitalism and imperial militarism. See, that's the critiques of Coates and company, because they want to fetishize and reify race and white supremacy so that that's the fundamental issue. And it is a crucial issue. But if it's not tied to a critique of the hierarchies of empire and capitalism, It's just a neoliberal face posing as so progressive, posing as so radical. It ain't in the end that courageous just to talk about how racist America is. Now, I know that Kamala Harris has trouble with it. She said we're not even a racist country. Biden said we're not a racist country. Clyburn said we're not a racist country, just racist pockets. And it all started with Tim Scott. We're not a racist country. You say, oh my God. If we're in that kind of denial, then we're really in deep trouble. Mm-hmm. So to come along and say America's racist, which I agree with Coates and the others, yes, that's true. But that's just a starting point. And if you don't go further with your critiques of empire and predatory capitalism, you're going to end up reproducing structures of domination that are going to continually weigh heavily on the Black masses as you go off and live in your mansion and buy your second house in Martha's Vineyard and get your new jobs in a new university with millions of dollars and think that somehow you're on the cutting edge of being the vanguard of Black liberation. No, you're just doing well financially and successful in an unjust society.
You know, you talk about systems of domination, and it's certainly true within our borders, and it's also very true outside of our borders, where the United States, through our foreign policy, goes against the will of people in various countries. We topple governments, leaders who have been democratically elected. Right now, a big story is the whistleblower Daniel Hale, the one who leaked documents informing the American public about America's disgusting drone war abroad. He just got sentenced to 45 months in prison. We know what happens to whistleblowers these days if they, do anything courageous in informing the public about the wrongdoings of the Pentagon. Then you also see the type of discourse taking place in regard to the protests in Cuba. And what's fascinating to me is, while there is a bit of an awakening in regard to human rights abuses within our borders, there's still a significant portion of the country that thinks that it's totally okay to, not only criticize, perceived human rights abuses or actual human rights abuses abroad, but say that we need to do airstrikes or use military force in response to that. Why is it that there's still kind of this illusion of freedom within our borders? Because I think that that's not really the case. We saw the way some of those protesters were treated last summer, getting snatched up by federal agents and thrown into unmarked vans. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that you'd expect to see in the countries that we bomb, right? What can we do to kind of further the awakening about what's actually happening in our borders and what we need to do to actually address that, rather than talk about toppling governments we don't like?
Right. No, indeed. See, I think that the deeper one finds oneself in genuine struggle for freedom is the more readier one sees just how aggressive the repressive apparatus of the U.S. nation state is. So, we started with Bob Moser, get beat by white brother Castro, months in jail. We got H. Rap Brown right now, Tucson, Arizona, 40-some years, Imam Jamil, Mumi Abu Jamal, Sada Shakur, so many who got deeply involved in genuine struggle for freedom and found themselves up against ugly repression. And they didn't have to go outside of the borders to find that repression. Same would be true in terms of our precious brothers and sisters coming in from Mexico and the issues of the immigrants, the precious immigrants. You'll see just how repressive things are. Same is true in terms of our radical trade unionists. And even for intellectuals, good God Almighty, I was just reading about old brother Ray Ginger and his wife Ann Fagan and Carol Weiss King. These were folk in the 40s who were wiped out by Harvard and other places because of the McCarthyism and they were fighting for folk who were on their ways to jail. Carol Weiss King needs to be remembered as one of the great lawyers concerned with the vicious repressive apparatus of the nation state. Well, you look at her life and you see what's going on now with immigrants, you say, oh my God, there's continuity in terms of repression. Absolutely. But I do want to say this, though, in terms of what happens outside of our borders, that we have to be morally consistent in our defense of everyday people. When I take the case of Cuba, for example, I was just blessed to sign this statement to let Cuba live on behalf of the calling for the lifting of the sanctions. The sanctions have been immoral, they're barbaric, they're vicious, and so forth and so on. But at the same time, you see, if there were a letter that accented the Cuban government also being accountable to its people. So dissident voices that are being raised, being incarcerated and so forth. But that's authoritarian policies of the Cuban government. I would support that too. And they would say, well, Brother West, how can you sign both of them? Because I'm trying to be consistent. The people themselves are suffering. The fundamental sources of the suffering have to do with imperial sanctions. It has to do with the ways in which the Cuban Revolution had been circumscribed and so forth. But then the Cuban government itself must be made accountable, and therefore the critiques must be made of any authoritarian policies vis-a-vis ordinary people inside of Cuba. I know when I went to Cuba in 1982, I lectured about 25 times. It must have been about the 22nd time. He said, Brother West, you sound like a counter-revolutionary. I said, well, what am I saying? Well, you're saying that people ought to have the right to raise their voices and be critical of Fidel. I said, yes, I believe elites ought to rotate. And I said that on television. The elites rotate. You calling for Castro to rotate? That's right. They need to rotate. Well, that sounds kind of revolutionary. I don't know what you call it, but all I'm saying is I've come here to defend the Cuban people. And to the degree to which I'm at a critique of U.S. imperialism, which has been vicious, they get patting me on the back. Oh, Brother West, we appreciate that. You telling us, well, I'm trying to tell the truth. You know, I had a critique of the Cuban government. Oh, they came at me tooth and nail. Same was true with the racism in Cuba. We solved the race. We've solved the race problem. Get off the crack pipe. No, you haven't. But you've made some major moves, and let's work at it together. But the racism is still operating. So that you had to be honest and candid in such a way that you hope you're not just used by the right wing, because you got folk, in Florida, the right wing Cubans in Florida. Well, West is on our side, at least on this part, but he's on the other side. Well, it's just a matter of trying to be consistent. I'm not trying to make sides in this regard. We love the Cuban people, period. How do you keep track of this stuff?
Thank you for that. That was
Yeah.
great.
No, and Dr. West, I think you've been very generous with your time. I think before we let you go, you said you're heading off to go campaign for Nina Turner. If you had a message to deliver to our viewers about who Nina is, what she's like, and why you support her, I think that'd be great.
Oh, yes. Well, first I want to say that we must do all we can to keep alive the higher standards of moral, spiritual, and political excellence represented by Jacobin magazine, who has to do with truth telling and justice seeking. So it's very important. It really is. It's like trying to keep alive the best of the jazz tradition. You see, how you gonna keep that alive? Don't say a word about Charlie Parker. Don't say a word about Sarah Vaughan. Don't say a word about Louis Armstrong. Don't say a word about Mary Lou Williams. You got to keep the standards up. And that's exactly what you all are able to do in terms of the history. It can't just be contemporary events. Tell the whole genealogy of the ruling class of the American empire now in its decadent moment. This necrotic moment, as he noted in that thing, you see. It's dying from the inside. You got to tell a larger story. So it is with our elected officials, that we go to Cleveland. We go to support Nina Turner. Why? Because she is a wave in a grand ocean of a Black progressive tradition that goes hand in hand with the U.S. progressive tradition and the international progressive tradition. And she is this crucial person at this moment is trying to hold up a bloodstained banner of truth-telling and justice-seeking that have to do with moral, spiritual, political standards of excellence. And that excellence is manifest in how deep is your love for everyday people? Do you look at the world through the lens of poor and working people? I don't care what color they are. I was just blessed to write the 60th anniversary for Franz Fanon's Record of the Earth. I got a chance to read it twice. It'll be out in a couple of months. And what is one of the fundamental points he makes there? The massive betrayal and pervasive neglect of poor and working people, of national bourgeoisies in every corner of the world, including the United States, including Black America. Nina Turner, I was going to say Nina Simone, because they really go hand in hand in terms of their spirit, their vision, their courage, their style, their willingness to tell the truth, right, is concerned about that kind of betrayal and neglect of poor and working people on behalf of politicians, including Black politicians, including Black neoliberal politicians like the one she's running against. That's why I go down to see Nina Turner in the spirit of Nina Simone.
Love it. Dr. Cornel West, you're an absolute legend. Thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. It's been an absolute pleasure, and we hope you'll do it again soon.
Well, I salute both of y'all. Stay strong now.
Thank you.
Strong.
There he is.
All right.
The man.
That was awesome.
Yeah.
It's nice to listen to the interview. I'm glad that it was pre-taped, because I got to I went lay down on the couch and just actually listen to what he had to say without stressing about what our next questions are going to be. And it's a good experience. So that was wonderful.
Yeah, it's just like the therapist voice of Dr. Cornel West in the back of your head on the couch. Yes, these are the orders. This is what I need to be doing right now.
Yeah. When I told him after the interview, after the tape was rolling, I was like, you just make us look cool. You just make it appealing on a purely, kind of visceral level to be a part of the struggle, because he's just so fucking cool.
Yeah, there's a lot of reasons that we owe Cornel West a lot on the left, but I think that's probably the principal reason. That, he's
not a lot of cool people on the left. Not a lot of cool people.
He's holding 51% of it up right now.
Yeah,
among all the left,
he's like Atlas. He's Atlas holding the entire cool ball of the left on his shoulders. One
of our fans must be a DeviantArt person. Someone make that image.
Yeah,
Cornel West holding.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I'm on screen because it's the end of the show and we do super chats. So
yes,
a couple of people sent in some super chats, so I'm going to get to those. But if you have any last minute pressing questions, send them in right now because we got to go in a little bit. But and we are live, even if the interview wasn't. But I wanted to, before we get to a question, Ratatouilleville sent some money in earlier. Thank you, Ratatouilleville.
Thank you. Delicious.
Thank you.
Carlos Reynosa writes, "Love you guys. Every week you continue to deliver quality content, and you help me look forward to kicking back on my Saturday mornings with a cup of coffee and your amazing show. Keep it going." Thank you, Carlos.
Love that. Right after Saturday morning cartoons, you just watch Jacobin Weekends.
Yeah.
Do they even have that anymore? Do they have that anymore?
Well, we're trying to up the budget for these things, so eventually we will have Saturday morning cartoons as a part of the weekends block.
Okay,
so,
great.
Great. Go to the Patreon, help us out, and make the cartoons real. That's my pitch.
Yeah.
Okay, a couple questions. Actually, before I do that, Cotton, thanks for the money. Thank you. Champagne Comunista, good friend of the show, writes, "In light of Cornel West's words, what are some of y'all's sources of insight and inspiration?"
Oof. What do you got, Anna?
So these days I'm a little more hesitant to have heroes. But so this is usually my go-to move when I need like clarity on something. There are people who have been around for a while, who have been consistent in their messaging, and their wisdom, I think, is incredibly important. And so it's not that I defer to them, but I take their perspective a lot more seriously than randos on social media or YouTube or anywhere else, right? Noam Chomsky, Richard Wolff, Cornel West. I mean, these are people who have a firm grasp of history, who have been consistent, who have proven themselves to be deep thinkers, and have never led me, at least, in the wrong direction in terms of helping me analyze what we're experiencing in the current moment. So those are the three names that come to mind right now. And, sometimes, you'll see like weird debates or whatever where one of them says something that doesn't go along with what some prominent content creator has to say. I don't engage in any of that. Again, these are people these are the G's, like they just know what they're talking about. So I go to them for inspiration. And like, I love Richard Wolff's podcast. I think his podcast is fantastic because what he does is he makes socialism and theory accessible to everyone. And so you don't have to be like some well-read political theorist or anything like that. Like you just understand, and he just makes it easy to digest. And he gives examples from around the world of how socialism works, how co-ops work, and I love it. So that's where I find a lot of inspiration and also, more importantly, clarity.
Yeah, I mean, anyone who remembers the pre-neoliberal era, like who was an adult before neoliberalism, like I always find that they bring a different kind of perspective because they remember a different world. We've all grown up in this. We're all like fish in water. We don't know anything. It's hard to imagine a different world if you don't know a different world, if you haven't experienced a different world. They remember. I mean, like Chomsky talks about all the time what political life, working class political life was in the 1930s, which he remembers, which is a completely different political culture than the one we live in now. And I find it interesting to hear him talk about that stuff because, again, for us, anyone born, after 1970, essentially, you just all you know is this. All you know is this kind of the long march of the sort of furious reaction of capital with no ability to fight back, just like victory after victory after victory for capital. Like that's all we know. It's hard to imagine a different world, like there's I remember when Adam Curtis went on Chapo, he like asked them, is like, do you really want change though? And they were all like, like they think they do, we think we do, but it's like, do you really want it? Like change, you haven't witnessed it. You've never understood, you don't know what that is, So I always find listening to people who remember a completely different political life, political culture, economic life, just interesting to listen to.
I'm so glad you mentioned that particular Adam Curtis interview because I remember that and it was like the most perfect, like...
it hit me like a ton of bricks. I was like, do I really want change?
Like, okay, so if someone had told that to us today, it'd be like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. But like the moment that he said that coming out of the 2016 election and like before... the kind of the in between Bernie 2016, Bernie 2020. And it was like, yeah, same. It hit me so hard of like, oh my God, this is what's at stake. And the way he said it, that, there's millions of people across the world that want change and change is going to happen. And it's like Nando's saying, it's hard to conceive of at times because so much of how we understand life and society, like in the neoliberal era, is that society doesn't change, that society is inflexible. The only thing that changes is our reactions to society. And there's like, and when people
politics can't change anything, that as much as we pour into it, that politics can't change anything. Like that was really what happened, is they just kind of removed politics from the equation. like the fucking Fed decides what the economy does. You know what I mean? Like we don't have any say over it. Like I mean that's a reductive example, but of what I'm talking about. But that's basically what it is. And like we pour all this energy into it. But very little. There are very few political avenues to affect change. And that's just kind of that's a strange place to be in.
It reminds me of Adolf Reed and Mark Dudzick's description of neoliberalism, which is it's the period of time of capitalism where there's no working class opposition. Like it's highly simplified, but that's basically it. Like that's why we don't see change like in a progressive way, like to the betterment of working people's lives at the level of society. Like, and everything just redounds to, well, you just have to deal with it better. Like, figure out how to manage yourself better and your thoughts.
Self-care.
Yeah.
And, just going back to Champagne Communista's question, I know I bring her up a lot, and it's just she has a pretty big impact on me and the way that I've seen, or like the way that I kind of analyze systems. And it's Barbara Ehrenreich, right? Because what was the last thing you said? I just lost my train of thought, Kale. My bad.
She's an OG. I mean, just
she is an OG, yeah.
No, that you can't change anything. You can only manage it better.
Yeah. Pushing back.
Yes, exactly. And like she's just so good at fighting back against that narrative and making it abundantly clear that no, that myth of personal responsibility is bullshit and don't buy into it. Because there was this video, it was produced by More Perfect Union, I think, and it featured a worker from Topeka, Kansas, the Lay's factory there. And man, that video hit me. Like it haunts me. It haunts me. There's a point in the video where the worker who had been electrocuted on the job and permanently disabled talks about taking money from his child's piggy bank to be able to pay for medical bills and stuff. And he just starts sobbing. He's just, and the reason why it haunts me is because you can see how that myth of personal responsibility leads to self-loathing, right? Making you feel like you're not good enough. That's why I love Barbara Ehrenreich, because she pushes back against that so well. And I highly recommend reading her work. She does it really well in Bright-Sided specifically. So,
yeah. Just my last thought for the question, because I would second almost everything that's already been said as far as insights of the names.
Almost everything.
Yeah, probably. I don't know. I'm like, I would second okay. All the people listed, they're great, and I also like them. And Nando's point of the people that come from a different era of the left that have maintained their integrity over time have been so vital. So. People like Ehrenreich, people like Adolf Reed, Vivek Chibber's been an important mentor for me. Although they don't fit this description, Chapo was really important for me coming to the left, especially Amber. But I think for the second part of it of where do we inspiration, I guess, how do we. I take that kind of how do you keep going? How do you, despite the enormous, the wall of opposition to our worldview and our politics. I found most of my inspiration, honestly, through friends that also organize. That it's seeing friends that are involved in Medicare for All campaigns and things like that, where I realized oh no, we can actually struggle for something better, and we might not always win, but there is something worth fighting for. And when you're in campaigns and you end up meeting ordinary people who having those moments when people realize oh, I'm not alone. I'm not crazy for thinking that this world is fucked up and could be a lot better, that it doesn't have to all redound to, me changing my opinion or my attitude or my behavior on something. It could actually be changed at the level of society. Seeing someone realize that is honestly where I probably gotten the most inspiration. When I've canvassed for Bernie, I felt like I was an evangelical or something, all of a sudden, I have a purpose. I'm speaking the word of God. And it's when you're in campaign mode, it's different than when you're, trying to get the theory right or understand the history or whatever. But, but I think what it is it's like actually making those real connections with people and seeing them like respond and say, oh wait, actually, no, we can collectively have a better world. I think those have been the moments that have touched me the most. And again, and, when I'm not doing that, it's like friends who also do this kind of work. And, just knowing that you're not alone in your principles, knowing that other people also realize it's so fucked up that, healthcare is private in this country, that, people don't have a living wage. Like, people like having that acknowledgement is inspiration. And then, and then you turn to all these people we mentioned to get the analysis right. Look at Chomsky, Adolf Reed, Vivek, Bhaskar, Amber, others, Dr. West. Like and subscribe, share the video. Okay, last few because we got some right at the end, and I don't want to ignore them. Eclectic had asked us, or he or she first said, I always find Dr. West to be so inspiring, but at the same time, it's so frustrating the media won't have him on, and Harvard won't ever, or won't even give him tenure, which is preposterous. How can we help amplify his and other voices? Hit like, subscribe, and share.
Yeah, hit like, subscribe, and share. Rate, share with your friends. Dr. West is one of the few who actually does every once in a while get on like cable news or whatever. Like he is able to get on CNN every once in a while, and it like always goes viral. Like everyone's like, oh my God, like who is this guy? And then like, wait, no, what happened? Like shut this down. But
who let this man on our airwaves?
Yeah, what happened there? But I mean, it's a structural thing. It's not, there might be like some individual producer at CNN who like, sneaks him in every once in a while, but the structures of for-profit media make it so that people who are anti-capitalist will not make it on air. That's always going to be the case. Always.
Yeah, I believe it or not, CNN does not, and cable news overall, I mean, with the exception of maybe Fox, like they don't have the kind of influence that I think people think they have. Well, when Cornel West goes on, you're right, like his segments tend to go viral, but most people aren't watching CNN. Like, I think like on any given day or night, like it barely pierces 1 million live viewers, right? And they don't put most of their content up online for like video on demand. So I say that as, don't be too hyper focused on the traditional outlets that, pretend like people like Cornel West don't exist. But I think going back to what Kale was saying earlier about organizing and all of that, and I mean, Cornel West was sharing the same message. I think that's just far more effective than more media. You know what I'm saying? Like there's a lot of these shows on YouTube actually get more viewership per video than like any broadcast of a CNN show is going to get. So, it's good to keep building up that media infrastructure, but that's such a small, in my opinion, a small percentage of what the left needs to be focused on. I think like the organizing is far more important, especially on a local level where you have more of an opportunity for change in your immediate environment,
Yeah, I mean, I go back and forth on that, and like all the time, I really do. Like I go from thinking that all of the the media, the New York Times and CNN and MSNBC are just completely irrelevant given their tiny audiences relative to the larger population. But on the other hand, in something like, for example, the Democratic primary, which is the participants in that are a relatively small percentage of the population, but have a huge outsized influence on the overall trajectory of political life in America. The media does have a huge effect on those people, and I mean, I think we saw that with the ease with which they dispatched of Bernie. Once the media coalesced around and everything coalesced around Biden, it was just like, oh, bing, see ya. And I do think that while they're not like on any given night a huge amount of people viewing it at any given moment, the kind of ripple effects that stem from that can be quite significant. And have a pretty big effect. And so but again, at the same time, then I think it ebbs and flows. Like I think they have an effect on like around, election time, and people are like, oh my God, I got to tune into the show of this thing. And like right now, like you see when there are no elections going on, and you see like the media, the sort of ratings on all the cable news channels have like collapsed, like absolutely collapsed. The thing that other people don't realize is that their business model doesn't depend on ratings, but that's a whole other thing, that they don't care really about the ratings, but that's a whole other thing. But
you're right. And you're correct in saying it ebbs and flows. And I think what Bernie tried to do with his campaign was kind of like bypass what I think he knew what was going to happen with cable news and all of that, by focusing on, because the people who are like watching cable news and just like eating it up during each election cycle, those are people who are going to go out there and vote, right? Like those are people who tend to get to the ballot box and cast a ballot. But Bernie was all about activating the largest portion of the electorate, which is non-voters. And, it didn't work this time around, but I do think that was the right strategy, right? Reaching out to these voters who don't believe that the government is ever going to do anything to improve their lives, sitting down with them and communicating with them. No, I'm different. Here's what I want to do. Here's what I'm going to fight for.
Right. And not only do just half the country not vote, but the vast majority, way more than that other percentage, way more people don't watch the news. Like most people in America don't watch the news. And when you do look at the ratings and you do look at the numbers, like the amount of people.
Well, they don't watch cable news, but a lot of people watch local news.
Yes.
Right. And a lot more people watch TV. A lot more people watch TV in general than we realize, because we're young, cool millennials. But like, the amount of people that watch TV news is far outstrips the amount of people that consume their news online.
Okay. My point is just that that wasn't my point.
You're just admitting that I'm correct. Thanks, Gail. Yeah.
Nando's correct. But my point is just that most like working people don't, they're not stuck in the situation they're in because the news told them, you don't deserve anything. Like they already know like their situation's fucked. Most working class people know like they're in impossible like circumstances with really bad options available. Like that's where I think Anna was right a moment ago when she was saying that, it's important to get, if we do media, it's important to have the media, but like you fundamentally need to be able to have conversations with people and organize them. And that's like, in some ways, like we got the left media down. Like we're going to keep doing this. You'll see more of us. Hopefully more people will see more of us. But like the most fundamental thing now post Bernie is we have to expand our organizational capacity on the left tenfold. That, the amount of, whether it's in campaign work or electoral work or whatever, our ability to actually really have real conversations and relationships with ordinary working people and build trust with them. So they say, actually, I'm willing to, to be in that precarious situation where I'm taking on the boss or that corporation or that politician or whatever, because these people, all those things have way more power than any ordinary working class person. And so you necessarily need common collective action in order to fight back. And so that's where, this wasn't at all what the question was, but like, this is like, we're going to keep putting Cornel West out there. And then what you should do is take the message that Cornel West provides and say, how can I then contribute to building the left and organizing, whether it's your coworkers, your friends, and ideally not your friends, people who you don't already know, that you should be building new relationships with other working people and building trust. Yeah. So
just like every time you match with someone on Tinder, try radicalizing them. That's what you got to do. That's like what organization means.
Second question, not the first one. Don't be like a nerd or anything.
Yeah, don't be a nerd, but radicalize them. What are you doing? Come on. Do people still use Tinder, or is there like a new one that I don't know about?
I think people still use Tinder. There's
Okay. Cool.
Okay, last two super chats. LJ writes, he sent us some money for Weekend's cartoons, The Mechanical Bull, and the G's.
Thank you.
I believe Nando's working on the Mechanical Bull, and we will provide updates soon on that.
Yes.
And then finally, TechStan sent us some money earlier and said, "Love the show. I do miss the salt segments. We'll get salty again soon."
Yeah.
We're always salty.
Will we?
I don't know. We get. We're like.
I don't know if you. Be careful what you guys are asking for. I don't know if you want that.
Next time Pelosi. Yeah. I mean, actually, Pelosi's constantly just bumbling through shit. So, we owe you a nice jab at Pelosi soon. We'll figure that out. Yeah. She deserves it. We all deserve it.
No, I don't think I deserve it. Only you guys. All right. It's Saturday. It's 12:30, Kale. It's 3:30 where you're at.
Yeah, my day is almost done. So
yeah. So
you guys should enjoy your weekend, and we will too. We're gonna say bye. Have a good weekend. Hit like, hit subscribe, share, and all the rest.
Thank you, Kale.
Later, Kale.
The awkward moment where we do a double show close where Kale says bye and then we say, right?
We have to say the official bye.
We like to give you guys bang for your buck, okay? Even though this is a free show. By giving you 2 goodbyes instead of 1. All right. Well, anyway, as always, we love you guys. Thank you so much for your support. Thank you for your super chats. Thanks for liking and sharing. And if you haven't subscribed to Jacobin's wonderful magazine already, please do so. I just got my latest edition in the mail, and every time it happens, it's like Christmas. It's like waking up Christmas.
I didn't
Christmas
get mine.
Day.
I'm really jealous. I haven't gotten mine. I gotta phone up Premier Busker and see what the hell's going on because I haven't gotten mine yet.
We have to see what the hell is going on. All right. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Nando, and have a great weekend. We'll see you next week.